Hello everyone, it's Will here from Singletrack magazine and singletrackworld.com, and welcome to this review of the 2019 Merida One-Twenty 8000. Now, to kick off this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the unique features on this bike and what makes it special. And then we're going to go into some detail about how I've got it set up for the trail. And finally, and most importantly, I'm going to be telling you how it actually rides and how it's held up over the past 3 months of testing. Now, if this is your first time joining us on YouTube, consider hitting that subscribe button just down there, because we have plenty more video reviews just like this one coming your way in the near future. Okie doke, so the One-Twenty is all new for 2019. If you're not familiar with this model, it is Merida's short travel trail bike. So we have 120 millimeters of travel on the back, 130 millimeter travel fork, and on this model, 29-inch wheels. Now for this year, there are no fewer than 8 different spec levels available in the One-Twenty range. The cheaper models use a full aluminium frame, the mid-spec models use a hybrid carbon and alloy frame, and the top 2 models use a full carbon fiber frame set. Although most of the One-Twenty models will be rolling on 29-inch wheels, some of the spec levels are available with 27.5-inch wheels, but only for the small and medium frame sizes. Otherwise, it's 29-inch wheels for small, medium, large, and extra large frame sizes. The model I've been testing here for the past 3 months is the One-Twenty 8000, and it's one step down below the top of the range 9000 model. Now, when this bike first showed up, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. For me, my distinct memory of Merida mountain bikes from several years ago is kind of more European style geometry, kind of marathon type bikes. A little bit twitchy, lightweight, a little bit old school. First look at this bike though, and it's very clear this bike is none of those things. It's a pretty burly looking rig. Up front we've got 130mm travel ROCKSHOX Pike RCT3 fork, and in between the lowers we have a huge 2.4-inch Maxxis Minion DHR2 tyre. We've got SRAM code RSC brakes with 180mm rotors, very powerful brakes which you'd normally see on a downhill bike. Completing the trail oriented build kit, we have 760mm wide riser bars and 150mm travel dropper post. Now the One-Twenty 8000 gets the CF4 full carbon fiber frame set. According to Merida, this frame has dropped about 400 grams over the old version. Perhaps more impressive though is the full carbon frame is nearly a kilo lighter than the aluminium frame that comes on the cheaper One-Twenty models. That's quite a big weight difference. While the shape is fairly similar to the previous model, the new One-Twenty has been tweaked to be stronger, stiffer, and more trail oriented overall. The head angle is nearly 2 degrees slacker. We've got a 67.3 degree head angle. The seat angle's a touch steeper, 75.5 degree effective seat tube angle. And we've also got a slightly longer reach as well. On the medium bike I've been testing here, it's 435 millimeters. Now Merida has shortened up the chainstays by 10 millimeters, so we have a 435 millimeter rear center length. However, the overall wheelbase has gotten longer, and a lot of that length is in the front center due to the longer reach and also that slacker head tube angle. Compared to other carbon fiber mountain bikes on the market, the frame tubing on the One-Twenty is fairly low profile. We've got a nice compact mainframe with a drop top tube. That increases standover clearance, but it does limit the amount of clearance around the bottle when you've got a cage fitted in the mainframe. On the medium-sized bike I've got here, you can fit in a 600ml bottle, but it does end up quite cramped in there, and I found it quite fiddly to remove and install while I was riding. It's worth noting that on the large and extra large frame size, that will be less of an issue though. The back of the bike takes a fairly narrow stance, and that's all about providing plenty of clearance for your heels on the back of the bike. I found even when I was running flat pedals and big chunky flat pedal shoes, I had no issues with rubbing on the back end of this bike. Moving further back, the frame does flare out to accommodate the 148mm wide boost rear hub on the back here. The seat stays are fairly slender overall, but the chain stays, nice boxy beefy tubing that we've got there to maximize stiffness through the back end of this bike. The rear brake is nicely tucked out of harm's way where it hides in behind the seat stay, but accessing those caliper bolts with anything other than a long-handled Allen key is a little bit tricky, particularly if you've got a multi-tool and you're trying to adjust the brake out on the trail. The other point worth noting is there isn't a huge amount of tyre clearance in the back of this bike. Merida states an official maximum width of 2.35 inches. I've been able to fit a 2.4-inch Bontrager XR4, but it is a little bit limited for mudroom. So if you are looking for a bike to fit new school 2.5, 2.6-inch wide trail tyres, then you may want to look elsewhere. The suspension design on this bike is called the Float Link platform. We've seen this on the Merida 140 and also the 160, and the idea is to actually float the rear shock between the upper rocker link and an extension off the end of the chainstays. And this allows the rear shock to actually float rather than being fixed to the mainframe. The goal here is to give a really nice floaty feel to the suspension design with a very gentle progression towards the end of the travel. We've also got a really neat internal cable routing solution with alloy bolt-up plugs at the head tube and down at the bottom of the down tube. It means that you can actually pull the cables tight in the frame, snug down those plugs before bolting them in, and that keeps the cables nice and taut inside the frame so they don't slap about and make noise. It's a very, very nice feature, and it does work exceptionally well. Now, I actually built this bike up out of the cardboard box, and I found it really easy to get set up, especially that X01 Eagle drivetrain, which is a pleasure to tune. The only mild annoyance I had was with the KS dropper post. Now, instead of locating the cable pinch bolt up at the lever end, KS is still putting that at the base of the dropper post, where it's really awkward and really fiddly to get set up. Once you do get set up, it's absolutely fine, but it's a bit of a pain in the bum to start off with. Most brands are flipping the orientation of the cable and putting the pinch bolt up at the lever end, where it's much easier to access and adjust. Now, I also set up the wheels tubeless. These come from FSA. They're the Gradient Wide R wheel set. They use carbon fiber rims which measure 29mm internally, straight pull spokes, sealed cartridge bearing hubs, and a buzzy 6-pull free hub mechanism. Confirmed weight for the wheels is 1720 grams, which is pretty good for a burly trail wheel set. Now, in terms of pressures, I've got the front tyre set up at 20 psi. I've got more in the rear tyre. This is a Maxxis Forecaster. It's 2.35 inches wide, but it is a bit lighter than the Minion DHR, so it's around 800 grams versus 920 grams on the front tyre. So in order to support the thinner and lighter carcass, we've got 26 psi in the rear tyre. As for the suspension, I did struggle a little bit with the ROCKSHOX pike fork. I found it a little bit sticky and overly progressive to begin with. It turned out that there were 3 bottomless tokens inside the debonair spring from stock. So over the course of a few test rides, I pulled one out, kept riding the bike, pulled out another one, until I ended up with 0 tokens inside the air spring. That's made it feel a lot more active, a lot more lively, with better access to the end of the travel. It's also meant I could run slightly higher pressures, so I've got 83 psi in the air spring to support my 70 kilo riding weight. I've got the rebound set pretty much bang on halfway. That's 9 out of 18 clicks on the rebound dial. As for the low speed compression dial at the top here, there are 18 clicks available there. I set that anywhere between 6 to 10 clicks depending on the trail conditions at hand. Out back, we've got the ROCKSHOX Deluxe RT3 shock. Now, this is a pretty big shock actually. It's got a 55mm stroke and a big volume debonair can. Combined with the 120mm of travel out back, it's quite a low leverage ratio design, and that means you end up with lower operating pressures. So to get 30% sag, I'm running just 110 psi in this shock. As a point of reference, the rear shock on the Trance 29 I tested just recently had double that pressure. So the system on here runs at significantly lower air pressures relative to some other bikes on the market. I will point out here that the anodized sag gradients on the ROCKSHOX shock and fork are absolutely fantastic. They make setup really easy, and you've also got a little line at the top to tell you where full travel is, which is really good to know. As for rebound damping on this shock, it has quite a slow tune from the factory, so that meant I had to speed up the rebound damping quite a lot, otherwise it felt really sticky and slow. So I ended up just 2 clicks off the faster setting, and there are 10 clicks available on that little dial. Now, this isn't going to be too much of a problem for heavier riders, but it may be an issue for lighter riders who might find the rebound damping to be a little bit slow even at the faster settings. Right, so on to the important stuff. How does this bike ride? Well, I must say I've been really impressed with this bike. This is a fantastic little trail bike. For a start, it has excellent suspension. There's a really nice supple off the top feel with the back end here. And that's a bit of a combination of that low leverage design, the trunnion bearing mount, and that big volume debonair cam, which helps to ease the suspension into its travel. So you get really good small bump sensitivity, excellent traction, and just a good rapid response to square edge hits. Compared to something like the Canyon Neuron CF, which I tested not long ago, the suspension on this bike is certainly more supple and more floatier overall. Although the suspension is quite sensitive, it's still sprightly at the pedals. Now, Merida has built this bike with just under 100% anti-squat when you're in the lowest gear and you're sitting at 30% sag on the rear shock. The main pivot sits just above and slightly forward of the 32 tooth chainring, so under pedaling inputs there isn't a whole lot of bob through the back of this bike. Now a big contributing factor is the stiff back end. The chainstays on this bike are quite beefy and chunky, and it gives a really good responsive and direct feeling under power. Now the rear shock does have a 3-position compression switch, but to be honest I rarely ever touched it. Even on long road commutes to and from the trail, I just left it wide open. I kind of forgot that it was even there. If you want though, there is a medium and a firm setting. It's worth pointing out though that the firm setting on the shock and the fork aren't full lockouts. They are literally firm compression settings, but they are quite balanced between the front and the rear, so they do feel the same when you are in that firmer setting. That said, even on the climbs, I just left the shock wide open. It's certainly efficient enough to get up the climbs without having to worry about losing a lot of your energy through the suspension bobbing up and down. And with that efficient suspension design, stiff frame and carbon wheels, this bike accelerates really well. Now it's not the lightest bike. Out of the box, this bike weighs 12.69 kilos without pedals. Now that's actually about the same weight as the Giant Trance 29 I reviewed recently. In comparison to the Trance 29 though, this bike feels more efficient and more responsive, just more sporty overall. I'd say the Trance 29 with its piggyback shock does have the edge when it comes to big hit control, but the Merida does very well all through its 120mm of rear travel. It's got a really gentle progression throughout the travel, so from the start to the finish there's about 10% total progression to this leverage ratio, and with that floating rear shock, the way it uses its travel towards the end of the stroke is very steady, very gentle. It's basically impossible to tell when you bottom this bike out, so there were many times where I was using full travel and I only realized when I got off the bike and discovered that the red O-ring had fallen off the base of the shock. Now because I was popping the O-ring off fairly regularly, partway through the test I did increase the air pressure in the rear shock. I went from 110 to 120 psi, and this lifted the sag from 30% to 25%. Now this did give the bike a slightly firmer feel underfoot with a bit better response through the mid-stroke, and it did reduce bottoming out significantly. And that responsive suspension combined with the fast pickup on the rear hub means this bike accelerates really quickly. It picks up speed very, very well. When you're weaving through the trees, you can feel that it hugs the ground quite closely. It has a fairly low center of gravity overall. We've got a 607mm stack height and a 40mm BB drop, so it does keep your weight fairly low to the ground. Not too low though. I measured the sagged BB height at 295mm off the floor, which isn't ridiculous, and the fact that the rear suspension doesn't wallow through its travel, it meant I didn't actually clip the pedals that much, even when I was running flats. Now the carbon chassis on this bike gives a really strong feeling from the grips all the way down to the rear dropouts. So carving corners and leaning the bike through successive turns feels absolutely fantastic on this bike. Speaking of the carbon frame, Merida says this is actually the stiffest frame it's ever produced, and that's compared to the 140 and the 160 Enduro bike. I can believe it too. It's got a really nice rigid and direct feeling, and that really helps handling on the trail, gives it a sharp feel through tight and twisty single track. And with the saddle slammed out of the way, it's an easy bike to maneuver. And the short and stiff back end means it's quite loftable. It's an easy bike to pop up onto the back wheel. But because you've got that stiff, solid front end on this bike, it also feels planted when you have to drop it down into really rough kind of rock gardens on the descents. It's not quite the straight line bruiser that the Giant Trance 29 and the white S120 are on the descents, but it does hold its line very well. The suspension works really hard on high-speed chatter and spiky hits, but when those impacts do get bigger, the bike can pinball around a little bit. The thing is though, if you do bite off more than you can chew, that solid chassis, those powerful SRAM code brakes, and the responsive handling means you can find an emergency exit pretty quickly if things turn south. Could it be longer? Slacker? Sure, it could be, and that would help with that straight line descending, but it would, in my opinion, come at the expense of this bike's spry handling, which is surely one of its best characteristics. Now, during testing, I wanted to see how the 120 would handle more pedally cross-country applications. So I took it along on a 65-kilometer point-to-point backcountry trail ride along the Goldfields track, and I also did a 50-kilometer race on it. I did the Golden Triangle Epic in my hometown of Bendigo. Now, to get it ready for racing and riding the Goldfields track, I put on a lighter set of tires. I put a 2.3 specialized ground control on the front and a 2.3 fast track on the rear. I also changed the saddle because the stock saddle is really not that comfortable. I put on an Ergon SM Pro, which is much better. Now for more cross-country riding, the 120 actually does really well. I've already touched on the efficient suspension design, but it's also a comfortable bike to ride. It's got quite a spacious cockpit. I did slide the saddle back a little bit on the rails and also drop the stem down on the steerer tube just to get the grips down a little bit lower. But otherwise it fits my 175 centimeter height really well. Now normally I complain about 760mm wide bars on an aggressive trail bike being too narrow, but on the 120 they kind of work really well with that 60mm stem. The front end steering is really good on this bike, there's no issues there really at all. It's also slightly more comfortable having those narrow bars on longer rides. You don't want to go too wide because that can put more strain on your shoulders and your upper back and your neck too. Also on old school single track where you have really close trees on either side of the trail, it's kind of nice having bars that aren't too wide where you're more likely to clip them on those trees. One thing I will point out on this bike is I really like these grips. These are Merida's own lock-on grips. It's a really small detail, but the profile on these is great. They're slightly tapered and they've got an angled tread profile, so when you rotate your hands backwards, like if you're throttling the grips, they actually increase traction. And they just feel really good in the hands, so hats off to Merida for focusing on nice small details like that one. And really overall, they've had few issues with this build kit. Merida has done a fantastic job speccing this bike and putting in quality components where it counts. It did have some rotational play develop over time with the KS dropper post. That was a bit of a surprise because I've had pretty good luck with KS droppers in the past. So it is a bit of a bummer because you can feel that rotational clicking side to side even when you're riding. While I absolutely love the SRAM Code RSC brakes, it's worth noting they do come with sintered metallic brake pads, which can be quite noisy under kind of more lighter duty cross-country applications. If you're after quieter braking, consider putting some organic brake pads in here. The only other issue I had was with the rear Maxxis Forecaster tyre. I literally punctured it within the first 5 kilometers of riding. It is a little bit thin through that casing, so if you are hard on tyres, you're going to want to add a bit of pressure to this rear tyre or consider something a bit burlier on the back end of this bike. I did end up sticking a tube patch on the inside of the tyre where the 2 snakebite holes are, and it seems to have held up okay so far. Otherwise, the bike has been really quiet with no creaks or groans anywhere from the headset or bottom bracket or pivots, and I should point out there that this bike is rolling on full sealed cartridge bearings throughout the back end. Some other bikes within this travel class, like the Scott Spark for example, does use bushes on some of the pivots on the back end. So it is nice to see Merida give the back of the 120 a full complement of sealed cartridge bearings. Right, so 3 things that could be improved about the Merida 120. Well, firstly, I would like to see more clearance around the water bottle cage for the medium and small frame sizes. As it stands right now, there's really not enough clearance there and the bottle is very tight and quite awkward to get in and out of the frame. The second thing is the KS dropper post. While I do like the southpaw lever and the action of this post is quite nice and light with an audible top-out thunk, the rotational play that developed was a bit annoying, and I'd also like to see the orientation of the cable flipped around with that pinch bolt put up at the lever end. The third thing is more of a mild annoyance, and that's to do with the TORX hardware for the pivot bolts. Now this is worth mentioning for prospective 120 owners to check your multi-tools and make sure they do have TORX keys so you can adjust those pivot bolts, tighten them up on the trail if they do come loose. And on to 3 things that I loved about the Merida 120. Well, the first is the supple and sporty suspension design. It's efficient, it has great sensitivity, and it manages that 120mm of travel really well across a wide range of riding types and riding speeds too. The second is the clean and well-engineered frame. It's light, it's stiff, and it's gimmick-free too. And the third thing is the SRAM Code RSC brakes. I really like these brakes. They have fantastic power, great modulation, and with the adjustable tool-free lever reach and pad contact adjust, it's very easy to get them set up for your personal preferences. So overall, what did I think of the Merida 120? Well, I really enjoyed riding this trail bike. It has a high quality carbon chassis, a great suspension design, and a forward-thinking component package, which means it's very well balanced overall. It's light and zippy enough to get up to speed quite quickly, but at the same time, it's burly enough to hold that speed when things get rough. It's not exactly pushing the envelope geometry-wise, but Merida has made a very strong case for exercising a little bit of restraint when it comes to the 120. Rather than being just a steamroller downhill, this is more like a mid-engine sports car. It's got great control, great agility and enthusiasm on the trail. With its no-fuss suspension package and that intuitive handling, this is a really approachable trail bike that's going to work well for a very wide range of riders. Now, if you'd like to read my full review of the 2019 Merida One-Twenty 8000, make sure you go to singletrackworld.com. There's a handy link in the video description there below for you to follow. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, consider hitting that subscribe button to make sure you get notified of all the videos we have coming your way in the near future. Otherwise, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo!